In a previous lesson, we created a gradient swatch, which is a smooth blend between two or more colors. In this lesson, we're going to discuss using and altering gradients. If you'd like to follow along, go under the File menu to Open, and in the Sample Files folder, scroll down to 1304, Working with Gradients, and just click Open. Let's start with the gradient panel. I'm going to go to my selection tool and just click on one of the rectangles. What kind of things can we control in the gradient panel? Well, first, what type of gradient is this? Linear, or is it radial, which is circular? And you can see that the left stop of the gradient is in the center of the radial gradient, and the right stop is in the extreme outside in the object. Let me go back to linear. I can actually change the angle that the gradient is traveling within the object. How about I go to 90 degrees and just hit return or enter. And you can see now the gradient is starting at the bottom and going to the top. If I wanted to flip that around so it was going in the opposite direction, I could just add a minus sign before the 90 and hit enter or return. And so now it's going from the top to the bottom. Let me go back to 0 degrees for the angle and just hit enter or return. I could also flip around the gradient itself, so the two stops will switch places. And you can see it's going exactly the opposite direction. Let me click that reverse again. I could also click on the various stops and move them. So the white is starting much further into the object. Let me drag it back again. The diamond shaped above the gradient ramp is actually the center of the change within the gradient. So right now, if I select that little diamond, you can see the location is exactly in the middle of the two stops. But if I click and drag that diamond, it's skewing the change further towards the direction that I'm dragging it. Let me go back the other way. And you can see that now the center of the change is much further towards the black stop. Let me go back to 50%. I'm just going to type 50 in the location field and hit enter or return. You can save gradients as swatches. All I have to do is go to the swatches panel, and I could just go under the options menu of the panel to new gradient swatch. Whatever gradient I've created, I could now name and save. But I could also do this. I'm going to go to the gradient panel again and click on the filled in gradient icon and drag it over the top of the swatches panel. And now just find an insert point for my gradient. If I wanted to change the name, I could just click twice on the name and name it. Now I have it as a swatch to apply again and again. Now there's also a gradient tool. So other than the panel, there's a tool. If you hit your G key, you will go right there and select the gradient swatch tool. I'm going to first select all of my objects. Go back to the gradient tool. And I'm going to click and drag. And when I do that, where I clicked first is where the gradient is going to start. The angle that I'm dragging at is the angle that the gradient will travel along. And wherever I let go is where the gradient will stop. So you can see, even though it's multiple objects, it looks like one gradient is filling all of those objects. Let me do it in the opposite direction. And now is traveling in exactly the opposite direction down the page. Now, if you've used the gradient tool in Photoshop or Illustrator, you're very familiar with how the gradient tool works in InDesign already. We'll be discussing strokes in the next lesson.